Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Several times on this show, we've mentioned the pre-web Silicon Valley frenzy for pen computing, which happened in the early 1990s. It's a part of Internet history that even I only have a vague knowledge of. So I was super excited in this episode to speak with Matt Kursh. Matt was heavily involved in this technology and is kind enough to give us an in-depth look at that mini bubble and explain how it happened and how it paved the way in a roundabout way for the modern handheld devices we're all familiar with today. Matt was also heavily involved in several Microsoft initiatives in the 1990s, including the pioneering local site Sidewalk, as well as the MSN.com portal at the height of the portal era. Please enjoy this excellent conversation with Matt Kursh.
Matt Kursh, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
My pleasure, Brian.
We always like to get a little bit of background first, so let's start with college. I believe you attended Brown University, right?
Yeah, I appreciate your careful use of the word attended. I went for 2 years.
What were you studying?
I did not finish. Well, you know, in 2 years you don't really have to make a decision, but I was mostly taking CS courses and music and architecture. I thought I was going to be a music major, but that didn't really matter.
So what caused you to leave Brown?
Well, it actually has everything to do with my experience in tech. I mean, I had helped my dad, was a surgeon, pick a office management system for his medical practice when I was in high school, and that's how he could justify paying me whatever he paid me to fund my college. So sorry, getting these headphones to work a little better. So anyways, when I was at Brown, the Macintosh came out, which like completely realigned the stars in the universe for me. And I had this idea to do a medical practice management system on the Mac. So after my freshman year, I started this company that became Clearview Software, and I recruited a bunch of Brown students to work with me. And we all worked together. And then for a year, I did college and also worked on this company in the basement of a dorm room or dorm building. But after a year, I went on leave of absence. So I just passed my 30th anniversary of my leave of absence. So I'm very proud of that.
But clearly, even if you didn't get a CS degree, you had enough programming chops that you could go do a startup in software.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a lot of the deep scientific theory of computation knowledge that a CS graduate would have. I also have no idea if that's useful in everyday practice. But yeah, I didn't learn. We programmed everything back in the day in C, and they didn't teach C. They taught Pascal and assembly language, and I knew BASIC. But I learned C on my own as part of the business, and that worked great. And I think the other guys on the team were much more capable coders than I was.
So Clearview's successful enough that it's eventually sold to Apple. Well, I guess specifically Claris, which kind of was Apple.
Yeah.
And about what year was that? 1989, maybe?
Yeah, we sold them the publishing rights. The company pivoted from doing medical stuff to doing desktop publishing stuff. And although, of course, the word pivot wasn't applied to these things for another 20 years. But
right.
we moved to that space. We sold them the publishing rights in '87, and then they bought the company in '89, which led to me moving out to the Bay Area.
And you're at Claire's for maybe a year or so?
Yeah, not even. I mean, basically, they, of course, they bought it, the company, to develop the product, and they also had bought FileMaker not long after Smartform, and they were different but similar products. And Claris was thinking they wanted to go public as an independent company, so they were really manicuring their P&L, and so they decided they weren't going to develop Smartform any further, which had the positive side effect for me and the other guys of letting us out of our employment agreement. So the moment they made that announcement, I started looking for something else to do.
Well, the something else that you do is another startup called Slate Corporation. But before we talk about what Slate does, one of the reasons, as I said to you, I'm eager to talk to you is to lay the groundwork for what was the pen computing sort of bubble of the early '90s, late '80s, early '90s. So I wonder if you could maybe outline when you start to hear about pen computing, why it was a thing in the Valley in the late '80s.
Yeah, I'm literally feeling chills right now. There's only a few times I think in my life where I saw a product that just completely knocked me sideways, and I still remember. So it would have been early 1990 when my friend Mitch Stein, who I'm still good friends with, he had gotten involved with these guys at Slate, and he came to my crappy little rental in Los Altos, and we sat in my backyard, and he pulled out a tablet computer that was, a prototype that was very confidential at the time. It was about the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and it had no keyboard, of course, and it had a bitmap display, and it had a pen. Much more like the current Apple Pencil in the terms that it was an active electronic pen, and the whole organizing user experience was around a notebook and was very pen-centric, and it was just a holy shit kind of moment, because you got to think about at the time, people we didn't even have laptops with LCDs in any quantity, let alone something like this. And even though it was only black and white, it really felt like a Star Trek episode or a glimpse into the future. So the whispered belief in the Valley at the time was this was going to be the NBT, the next big thing, and so the timing was great. Mitch was one of the early guys at Slate, and they didn't even have their Bay Area office yet because he ran it and hadn't opened it. And he recruited me to come in as the first other person in the office. And I think Slate was the first pen computing application company anywhere. So that's how early it was.
Right, I was gonna say, like, when you see that first tablet computer, what does he demo you? Like, what are the applications or the use cases that he's showing you? Could be possible.
I think at the high level there was just the basic organizing. You could think of it as the OS shell, but in this case it looked like a notebook that had tabs and pages, and so. When you wanted to create a new page, you used a menu and it created a new page, and the page could be a word processing page or a drawing page. I think those were probably the main apps that were just built in as kind of system apps. And then, of course, there were no applications companies. So the larger question was, what the hell do you do with this thing? And I'm not sure that was ever clear, even during the next several years as pen computing came and went. I think part of the reason it went was we didn't know what it was for. I don't think that's the only reason, but that was a big reason. but nevertheless, the experience of seeing something that acted that fluidly and that personally and that wasn't this big box with a keyboard. I mean, it was just it was amazing.
And you say that it was the firm belief of Silicon Valley at the time that this was the next big thing. And just to give users or listeners context, I mean, there would be in short order things famously like the Newton, and also a little more forgotten today, but what was a major startup called Go Corporation. So tell us a little bit about that scene, that as it were, of the startups that are trying to chase this pen computing thing.
Well, this device that Mitch is showing me, I should have been more clear, is a device from Go Corporation. So it was their reference hardware running their operating system, which was called PenPoint. And so, that's what I'm looking at. Go is really well funded. Kleiner Perkins and several other big venture firms were behind them. And there were some heavy hitters there. So that was, I think, really way ahead. Newton came a little later and had a somewhat different concept. We were engaged with them in time as well. Over time, there would be other folks too, like GeoWorks. Wasn't exactly pen-based the way I recall it, but they had a kind of a lightweight computing platform. And then further down the pike will be General Magic, which we'll probably talk about. And they weren't really pen-based, but more mobile. And then there was Microsoft doing what they always do, which is saying, we're going to do that too. So they said they would do a version of Windows that had pen support.
And then freezing the market. But let's come back to your story just real quickly. So you then are only at Slate for, again, around a year, and then you decide that you want to do a startup yourself in this pen space.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Slate early. My buddy Mitch, I think, left after around 6 months. And I started having product ideas for pen devices. And, it's the classic entrepreneur story. Like, I could either share my stories, my ideas at Slate, try to convince management to support them, and then get paid a couple shekels to do it, or I could just leave and do it myself. So, I'd already started and sold a company. It was pretty obvious what I was going to do. So I got to my first anniversary and vested my first load of stock, and I resigned.
And the company you start is what?
Well, it was called Ink Development. It became eShop. But the idea was to, do software for pen computers.
Specifically, what sort of software?
Well, we had a couple ideas. They were ideas I had come up with. There was a drawing application, and the guy who was going to create that was Pierre Omidyar, who, of course, went on to found eBay. So I knew Pierre from Claris. We used to play soccer together. And then we were going to do a note-taking app and what was called at the time a PIM, a personal information manager, which is contacts and calendar. And so I had 3 initial partners. In addition to Pierre Omidyar, there was Arnold Blinn and Greg Stein, and then a guy named Will Poole, who started helping with the kind of business planning early, and then joined as a founder after about 9 months or a year. So we were early, not as early as some, but I knew what everybody was doing in the pen space because I was in the thick of it. Literally, Slate was in the same building as Go, a couple floors away from them. So it was a very cozy little industry. So I felt confident that we had some ideas that were differentiated in the market.
And are you only developing for Go, or are you developing for whoever becomes a player?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Brian, as I was clawing through some of my old files before this, it was kind of funny to see the kind of rolling strategy reflected in the different documents I found. And at first, the only thing worth developing on was Penpoint with Go. But then Microsoft really put together an interesting system, so we started working with them. We talked to the Newton guys. I don't think there was really anything there. They were building a lot of stuff in, so less of an opportunity for independent guys. And then over time, got connected with General Magic and started working with them.
Tell me a little bit about General Magic.
Well, General Magic, when you and I were chatting earlier this week, it's for somebody involved at the time, it's strange how completely unknown they are today, although it makes sense.
Even to me. I knew the name, but I didn't know the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so imagine a consortium of companies. We're talking about Apple, AT&T, Sony, Philips, and Matsushita. So Matsushita, which is Panasonic. They all invested in this company, General Magic, and the idea was they were going to go create the new consumer communications platform for the new century. So it's a small device about the size of a 4x6 card with a touch screen. This is a point in time when even Wi-Fi isn't that common, and there's no cellular data. So you were gonna plug a RJ11 phone jack into this thing a couple times a day to connect to the not the internet, but to their private messaging and communications infrastructure. Andy Hertzfeld, who was one of the prime movers behind the Mac, was one of the key guys at General Magic, so it had that kind of friendly look and feel. And so it's kind of, if you want to tell kind of the story, it's really a story of kind of top-down technology versus bottoms-up. And bottoms-up, of course, is the web, and it kicked the ass of the centrally planned kind of corporate designed solution, and General Magic didn't get anywhere.
Yeah, see, I feel like that's the thing that might kind of boggle the mind of someone that doesn't remember those days, is that so you have all these, smart people, all these big money corporations coming into trying to develop something when it almost would feel like with the benefit of history that there was no there yet. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're creating all this hardware, but like the actual use case kind of hadn't been even developed before the web came around.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the use case that was imagined was similar to the web. It just wasn't an open platform. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was about email, mm-hmm. and it was about all kinds of online services, shopping, travel, etc. You have to realize that, and you do, but some listeners won't, is that, AT&T as a monopoly was only broken up, I don't know.
1984.
84. So, it's impossible to imagine today that kind of centrally planned infrastructure. But, AT&T didn't have to figure out how they get people to adopt touch-tone phones, because they just told them you have to adopt touch-tone phones. And likewise, their mindset here, though they understood, I mean, they weren't kind of lost in the past, but they understood they were going to have to convince people. But nevertheless, they were used to leading not just the market, but society. So that, the idea was, we're going to deliver this fantastic device and services, and people are going to drive down to the store and buy one of these and sign up for service with us, and it's going to be wonderful. And it's impossible to say whether it would have worked absent the web, but when the web happened, and more broadly the internet, this vast open TCP/IP pipe, it just blew away mm-hmm. this idea of a controlled approach. I mean, in one world, if you wanted a website, you started one today. In the other world, it was call up AT&T and negotiate a deal that allowed you to put something on their service.
Right.
Come on, which one's going to win?
Right. Well, actually, what devices actually ever reached market? Like, was there any sort of consumer uptake to pen computing? I mean, I remember I still see Newtons around occasionally, but like, did it get any traction in the market at all before the web hit?
Yeah, it got a little. So, you have to kind of look at the different platforms. So, Go licensed their operating system to a couple players. One, NCR produced some. I think, I'm not sure if NEC produced any, the Japanese manufacturer, but the biggest player in the Go space was another startup that people don't know about anymore, which was called EO. And EO was basically the pinpoint device company that was funded by VCs and also by AT&T, to really confuse AT&T's role in all this. So AT&T was big into EO. So you could have bought EO 440, which was a little one, or an 880, which was a bigger one. They were a little pricey. What was the use case? As you kind of suggested, it was a little unclear. We didn't have Wi-Fi. We didn't have wide open internet messaging. The idea of sending an email to a person at another company was not really, in the, consciousness of the technosphere. We didn't do that. It was all internal stuff. So you could do email inside your company, but that's about it. You could take notes and stuff like that, but they didn't get a ton of traction with those things. And separately, Windows got a lot more traction, not surprisingly, and Compaq shipped devices. And we actually were bundled with Compaq's device, which was kind of our big win. And we were also bundled with NEC's device. And a number of other PC OEMs shipped pen computing devices back then, basically running pen Windows.
And one detail here, is it all pen-based handwriting recognition as the interface, or is there any touch interface, or even the tiny keyboards that we would be more familiar with?
A lot of the pen Windows devices, they were kind of two form factors. One is a tablet that looked kind of like like an iPad with a thyroid condition, big fat things, but way better than a laptop in size. And then the other ones were these kind of convertibles that are very much like the Windows convertible tablets of today, with a keyboard that you could hide or pull out. So there were some pen Windows machines that I think were very capable and had their advantages over a traditional laptop. But there just wasn't enough innovation in the hardware or in the software space to get a lot of traction in it. So, they sold, Compaq sold a bunch of them. But, it wasn't too much longer that the internet started happening. Right. And it was pretty clear where the innovation was going to focus.
Well, let's tell that story via your story then. So, again, using the word that maybe wasn't common at the time, explain how you then you pivot to what eShop becomes.
Well, so the story there is, necessity is the mother of invention. So I've told this hundreds of times, this phrase since then. But, the good news is I think we were probably the leading applications company for pen computing. And the bad news was pen computing died. It just didn't go anywhere. And so we did pretty well on PenPoint, but PenPoint didn't do well. We did really well on pen Windows, but it did okay, but it didn't take off. And in the mix here, we got in touch with the General Magic guys, and they called us one day and said, we have a developer's kit. Would you guys like it? And, of course, why wouldn't we like it? It wasn't until later that I realized that Jimmy Friedlander, I think, was the guy's name who was calling me. Jimmy was precise in his language. He had one developer's kit. That's how many they had. And we were the first ones to get a developer's kit. So that meant we had like totally greenfield. We could do anything we wanted on General Magic. And the the trick was, what would people want other than what was built in? And as you kind of ran down the business case, there was just this huge problem, massive, huge problem, which was you could write anything you wanted. There was no way to get the software onto the device. It didn't have a floppy drive. There was no clear way to tether it and get stuff onto it from another device. It had a PC card slot, but the cost for to manufacture a PC card, per unit cost was in the neighborhood of $30 or $40. So obviously you could not possibly build a business on something that costs you $30 just for your cost of goods. So we really struggled with this. It was kind of this very frustrating situation. We could develop anything we wanted, but there was no way to get it onto the device. And so we came up with this idea, which was, hey, that's the opportunity. Let's build an online software store that'll let people who have these devices go and buy software. And so I'm actually looking at my slide deck from August of '92, where I walked through this stuff. I was surprised how early it was. But we had this concept. The company was called Ink, and we called the concept Ink and Roebuck. And the idea was, we'll build the platform to sell software. But
you know what? I hope I'm not insulting the listeners here, but I think we should explain that's referring to Sears Roebuck.
Yes, I thought about that. Yes, Sears and Roebuck, that's the reference. And so we were Ink and Roebuck, and so the platform, the idea was like, we'll sell software, and of course, from a platform perspective, you're going to fill a database up with information. It doesn't really matter if it's information about software or tennis shoes or books or anything else. You might as well just let anybody sell anything. So we had proposed this to General Magic, and they were, very happy, because instead of just being a single solution, we'd be really a whole class of solutions. And AT&T, who was building all the messaging infrastructure, was really happy, because they weren't going to have anything but plain old consumer messaging. So they signed a big contract with us, and we were building all the infrastructure, not just to sell software, but we had Tower Records, which at the time was the biggest music retailer, and 800 Flowers, and a big consumer electronics firm.
So literally just a full service electronic commerce platform.
Yeah, and so people ask me, how did we get into e-commerce? And it's just the craziest story, right? Like, why would you ever think it would happen this way? But we started building it for General Magic, and then lo and behold, online really took off. And I don't mean the web, as you know. I mean, it started with CompuServe more than anything else, and Prodigy, and then AOL was kind of the vastly friendlier but smaller upstart. And this stuff just was going off like a rocket. And we're sitting there and saying, okay, well, our platform, our whole backend would work with that stuff. The backend doesn't care. So what if we wrote a client that would work just for regular old Windows? And so we started, we shipped the General Magic version, but it was almost irrelevant by the time it shipped. And then we shipped a version with a Windows client. We couldn't get our stuff into one of the proprietary online services.
Because they were doing them all themselves already.
Exactly. I mean, it's the same kind of proprietary versus open dynamic I mentioned earlier with General Magic versus the web. I mean, we were real eager to put our shopping client into AOL, but that was entirely at their control, and they had their own stuff and didn't want to do anything else. So we just shipped our own Windows client. Like, you literally got a floppy disk and installed it on your computer, and it dialed out on the modem and went to our back end. And that got some traction. That was neat, but that was going to be really hard to scale. And then the team, recognized we got to do an HTML version of this. And actually, Pierre Omidyar was quite a forceful advocate for this, and he was frustrated with me that we weren't jettisoning the older approaches quickly enough. And so, we were working on the HTML version of the system when both Netscape and Microsoft got interested in acquiring us.
And you eventually go with Microsoft. How come them instead of Netscape?
There were a lot of internal deal issues and boring stuff like that, and certainly there was a financial issue, and that was part of it. I think we also felt like, Netscape, I forgot at the time, but like Netscape had a couple thousand employees, and they had hired them all in the last, the prior 12 months. And here you had Microsoft with 25,000 employees or something, but they had spent 25 years hiring them. And it was Microsoft was just a much more, mature organization. And it was just unavoidable. They had systems and ideas and culture and practices, and Netscape was just crazy. I mean, back then, if you walked into the lobby of Netscape, you just felt the energy of the place. It was just bristling. There was so much happening. Everybody wanted to do business with them. They weren't even sure why. It was just their Netscape. Of course, I need to go do business with Netscape. So we just felt like it was the best place for us to kind of roll out this product was with kind of more older, more mature business.
Yeah, and Netscape actually didn't have much luck with its acquisitions. A lot of them got sort of disappeared. But so when eShop goes to Microsoft, it sort of becomes what we would know as the Microsoft Commerce Server, right?
Yeah, and I actually had absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, basically, as soon as we sold it, as I've often told the story, it was a Thursday in 1996. We closed the deal on Thursday. I got married on Saturday. I went on my honeymoon on Monday. I came back 2 weeks later, and my company was gone. Like, the whole team they weren't just like visiting Seattle. Like, they had bought houses and they had offices, and they were working at Microsoft. And Microsoft, I have to say, just did an amazing job, from what I could see at a distance, at saying, okay, these guys are our e-commerce experts. Our job is to support them. Go. So they really let the team just rock it. And I don't know, I think it took about 6 or 9 months for them to ship the first version of the Microsoft Commerce Server.
Just real briefly here, this is again something that listeners of the show know I bang on about a lot. But the fact that e-commerce in general, commerce on the web, commerce digitally, didn't just take off overnight. Like, it was a slog, and it was sort of a process of acclimatizing people to this kind of commerce. So I'm wondering if you have any recollections of that, thoughts on that, just the process of people getting comfortable with doing e-commerce.
Yeah, I mean, I often try to help people get their heads around how risky and dangerous it seemed back then, just because I don't think that's gone away, and I don't think we can take it for granted. I mean, the idea of I'm going to type my credit card number into a computer, and it's going to go someplace, and I have to trust them not to misuse it, and I have to trust them to send me the stuff, and I have to trust them to back up the purchase, and I have no idea who or what those people are.
You haven't seen the
That was,
product with your own eyes. It's just a picture on a page somewhere.
yeah, and I mean, as you know, I mean, these things move in hand. Digital cameras basically didn't exist in any usable form until 2000. I
Right.
mean, when
Yeah.
my first kid was born, I bought a 1 megapixel
Right.
digital camera for $1,000. It's pretty amazing. And so, even the idea of, I'm going to see a picture, for them to show you a picture of the product, they had to shoot film, develop the print, and then scan it in. So it was just, these sites didn't look very good. The product photography was lousy. The bandwidth was slow. I mean, I'm sure you've done this, but I would really encourage anybody to do this. Go back into the Internet Archive website and poke around the websites in 1995 and 1996. They look like crap. I mean, it's amazing that any of us uh, would look at these sites and grab our friends and coworkers and say, look how cool this is, because it really looks terrible. But, compared to what was possible before it, it was amazing. So, the sites were crude, and there was a lot of sensitivity about credit cards. Um, I know I mentioned to you when we chatted, we came up with, I think it was my partner, Will Poole, came up with this Inc. shopping guarantee that we basically said, if you have any credit card losses, we'll refund your money. And the thing that was funny about it was the credit card companies limit your losses anyways. There really is no exposure. I think your total exposure is like $50,
Hmm.
today and forever. But people didn't know. They were really worried. Like, if their credit card's out in the wild, who knows? So we made this big boast that really meant, I mean, it was true, but it didn't take much from us because there was no exposure. So it was scary days, uh, and there weren't a lot of people to shop from. I mean, I was driving my 16-year-old daughter to school, and her friend said, "Oh, I like your jacket," and my daughter said, "Oh, it's an Amazon jacket." It was a North Face rain shell.
Hmm.
And I laughed, and she asked why, and I said, "Well, it's just funny that you said it was from Amazon." Um, and she said, "Well, it is. It's from Amazon." I said, "Yeah, I know, but when Amazon started, all they sold was books.
Hmm.
That's it. I mean, you probably remember that when they started selling
Right.
CDs,
Yep.
I thought, who do they think they are? That they think they can sell books and CDs?" And here I am today, and I buy my favorite crackers and gluten-free flour from them. I mean, I buy everything from them. But at the time, it was just books. So it was very early, um, and at the time, the entire catalog business was $60 billion. I think if you kind of scrubbed away all the bullshit, the consumer catalog business is about $60 billion, and
Hmm.
and now I'm looking as we talk. Uh, I mean, not Google, Amazon's $107 billion.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just Amazon is,
Hmm.
is bigger than the entire catalog business back then. So, retail's really been reimagined since then.
Well, let's come back to your story then, because so you get acquired by Microsoft in '96. So that's right when the browser wars are starting. Microsoft has pivoted again. There's that word
Yeah.
to get super serious about the internet, everything internet. So when you joined Microsoft, what do you start working on?
So, the summer of '96 was really great. I just sold my company to Microsoft. I'm newly married. I'm on Microsoft's payroll, and I mean, literally no responsibilities. They don't give a shit. I'm the guy who used to run eShop. They don't need me. I'm not, I haven't coded for a long time at that point. And so I'm hanging out with my lovely new wife, enjoying San Francisco. And eventually I got pretty anxious. Like, if I didn't take control of the situation, something bad was going to happen. So I started flying up to Seattle and poking around. And I got really lucky. I met this guy, John Nielsen, who is pretty new he'd been at the company a long time, but he was pretty new VP in the consumer division, and he was responsible for Expedia and what became CarPoint and mapping stuff. And then he also, I think the biggest thing he was running was Sidewalk. And so he asked me to come in and be head of strategy, which was just great because I really liked John. I knew more about the internet. He knew everything about Microsoft. And it was a great perch for me to kind of get into Microsoft and learn about stuff. So, that was all in the time when Microsoft had this separate consumer division that included CD-ROM software and Microsoft Money and the MSN dial-up service and a small but growing number of websites.
Which Sidewalk was one of. So tell us what Sidewalk was attempting to do.
I like the use of the word attempting. I think it's very critical. So, Sidewalk is another one of those businesses that I think is a little hard to imagine today. But so Sidewalk was an idea that a number of people had come up with, I think roughly in late 94 or 95. And the basic idea was there should be some analog on the web to what local newspapers do. Not in terms of hard news, but in terms of arts and entertainment coverage, cultural coverage, more the commercial things like what happens in the classifieds, what happens a lot in the advertising between display ads and other advertising. So there was just a general idea of we should do something local on the internet. So the decision was made to focus exclusively at launch on arts and entertainment. And so a good analog is like comparing it to a city paper. Here we have SF Weekly or Pacific Sun or the Phoenix in Boston or something like that. And so by the time I was there at Microsoft, we had people in 10 U.S. cities, I think it was about 30 or 40 people in each city. And then we had people in a couple international cities, and they were all feverishly getting ready to launch a city-specific website. They hadn't launched anything. So, there were a lot of good things and bad things about it. I mean, all the people were incredibly talented. I think it's pretty clear now, 20 years later, when you look at Yelp, which pretty much fills the space. Not completely. They don't do so much kind of arts coverage. But the model, the heavy editorial model that Sidewalk had has not been shown to have traction. I mean, we had absolutely world-class editors, writers, producers, designers. I mean, these were really talented people, and correspondingly expensive people. And I think it's unfortunately the case that it's hard to make enough money doing that on the web to justify spending that kind of money. I mean, even of course today, just traditional newspaper businesses that were very large and very profitable and have been around for a century or more, those things are barely alive. So,
Right.
doing a subset of that is really tough.
It's interesting to me because on the one hand, you're right, like what you described Sidewalk was trying to do, you think to yourself, okay, that became Yelp, that became Craigslist or something. But then at the same time, it's an idea that still kind of hasn't worked, like this hyper local, like AOL had that experiment, the name of which escapes me, but doing the hyper local stuff still hasn't really kind of taken off.
Yeah, I mean the key thing is the again, acronym that didn't exist at the time, UGC, user generated content. I mean, if you would have told my editorial team instead of writing restaurant reviews, we're going to just let the public write them and then vote them up or down. I mean, half the staff would have, you know, jumped off a bridge, and the other half would have staged an armed revolt. I mean, it's just, that's certainly not what they do. And it's certainly, I mean, you could take a poll amongst your audience, but like me and my wife are constantly saying how, you know, we look at Yelp reviews and the conclusion is always the same. They're useless because you got somebody who says this is the best restaurant I ever ate in, and somebody else who says I was offended by how absolutely dismal the food service was. So other than the fact that it got 1,000 reviews and they average out to 4 out of 5 stars, is just really nothing useful about it. You know, we had great restaurant writers, but you have to pay that person. And to pay that person, you need to have a quantity of advertising that's pretty hard to get. And so it's hard. I mean, the model may work someday, but you know, the big newspapers can barely pay the bills at this point. So you know, I started at Microsoft just doing strategy, but after several months, John asked me to run a set of smaller properties, and then a little bit later, he put me in charge of Sidewalk. And you know, it's the kind of thing where, you know, the people were great, the concept was appealing, but this is a thing that really gets me worked up, and always has, is, you know, people look at an idea like Sidewalk and they'll say, and I'm not just talking about Sidewalk, but they'll say, oh, it was a great idea, but it didn't work. And to me, the way I look at it is like, no, if it didn't work, it's definitely not a great idea. It was an interesting idea. It was a compelling idea. It was an exciting idea. But great ideas are ideas that make money. That's the idea in business. And Sidewalk, there was no way. I mean, I won't say here how much we were spending, but it was incredible how much money we were spending on Sidewalk, and there was no way we were ever going to make our money back on it. And certainly nobody today is making money on what we were doing. And so, you know, what we did is two things. We added yellow pages and buying guides, so we turned it into a much more broad commerce play that still had local flavor because of the yellow pages, and that also had the side benefit of being a national business. Like, instead of just being in 10 cities, we were everywhere because we had national directories, so that was pretty easy. So that was stage one, and then the second thing we did, I think I'm getting this chronology right, is we sold the local arts and entertainment part of the business to, still around, City Search, which is part of IAC, which was part, at the time, had Ticketmaster in there. I don't know if they're still part of it, but we sold that part of the business because we just couldn't see any way we were ever going to really make money at it. And they still really believed they were doing the same thing, and they thought having teams in every city was really a good use of resources. And so they took that over from us. So when it was all done, in my involvement at Sidewalk was much more, it still had arts and entertainment coverage, but it was coming from City Search, so it wasn't a cost to us. And then we had directories and buying guides.
You were also involved in other Microsoft things like Home Advisor and Music Central, and I don't mean to skip over them, especially if there's interesting stories there. But at some point you take over MSN.com, the Microsoft portal, or is it even a portal when you start to work on MSN?
It's barely a portal. You know, so MSN's this interesting situation. So, you know, MSN started life. The thing called MSN, the first thing called MSN, was a proprietary online service like AOL that launched, I think, around Windows 95 time. Didn't do really well. Then it relaunches as, there's MSN dial-up service, and there's a MSN homepage, which is the default homepage when you get Internet Explorer, which at the time was increasingly the most popular web browser. It's not today, but back then it was by far the most popular. So MSN got quite a bit of traffic just because people ran Internet Explorer.
It was the first page that they opened.
They just, they didn't do, and they never changed their default homepage, so it just kept going there. So it was a little bit of a dicey game because we weren't really earning that traffic. We weren't doing anything wonderful for people. It wasn't like at the time people wanted Yahoo, they had to pick Yahoo. But they didn't have to, they didn't pick MSN, they just got MSN. But we put some stuff up on there, and I don't remember the exact sequence of how the page was developed, but I think it was early '99 that I gained responsibility for MSN, and I think it was the first time we really did a complete, top to bottom design for MSN and the whole MSN.com site and how does it all work, and we launched it very much with the intention of competing even more effectively in this whole portal space that you mentioned, which people don't talk about anymore. But there was Yahoo, and there was Excite,
Alta Vista.
Alta
Well,
Vista.
and actually Netscape.com also, because similar story is that homepage they discovered had a lot of traffic, so they decided to portalize it.
Absolutely. And the one thing I was thinking about, Brian, I don't know how much you've talked about it on the podcast, but it's really interesting. I was thinking about this before we started talking, which is one of the key developments that made all of this stuff possible really was the change in how tech companies could go public. I mean, in the early 90s, well, let's put it this way. When Claris wanted to go public, the conventional wisdom is I think you had to have 100 million in sales and like 3 or 4 consecutive profitable quarters. And there were a couple, in biotech, they had long done what they called concept IPOs, where somebody was believed to have a blockbuster drug. It wasn't necessarily even on the market, but they would go public and people would invest on the promise. That never happened in tech until the early 90s. I think the first one might have been 3DO, which was a game platform. You probably know about.
Yeah.
Trip Hawkins ran it. General Magic did a concept IPO. And then the big one was Netscape. And they stopped calling them concept IPOs because that makes it sound like it's magical thinking, because it was, but not good for sales. So they don't call them that. But with Netscape, it created this whole new liquidity option of going public. And there were, I remember when we sold the company eShop to Microsoft, there were people who say, well, you could go public. And I was like, we're a 50-person company. That's like the craziest thing I've ever heard. We have a couple million in sales every year. There's some great clients, great partners. It's a great thing, but go public. Come on, you can't go public. A year later, there would have been nothing interesting about a 50-person company going public. They were doing it regularly. Little companies were doing concept IPOs all the time. And that created really kind of this funny money climate, because if you could go public, either promise of or you did it, then you could go to Netscape's portal or MSN's portal group and you could say, I'll pay you $5 million to be on your homepage. And there's no way they were never going to make that $5 million back, but it didn't matter because they were going to get to go public, which was going to allow them to raise $300 million and make all their investors a lot of money. So it created this whole economy that never had existed before, and all these portals could extract money out of that economy. And so When I was running MSN, we definitely were building the portal to be able to, deliver a great experience to users and also to participate in this kind of new economy. Um, and there was a team of people working on what I think really was the first, web search engine that Microsoft built instead of just, used from someone else. A guy named Bill Bliss was building a new search engine. Um, and we built new ad systems. We were serving 250 million ads a day. So we needed our own technology to do that. So we went off and built that. And, it was an exciting time. I think in the fullness of time, it's become clear. Well, I don't know that the portal idea is not a good one, but it's clearly not the dominant kind of mode of use of the internet anymore. It's become less integrated.
I'm shooting in the dark here, but I want to go a little further in what you're doing in search in 1999, because obviously, you think a couple years later Google takes off and search becomes this amazing business, but other people from like Yahoo and Excite have pointed out that at the time, search itself was considered not very important and not very monetizable. And almost because the focus was keeping the eyeballs on your pages. So you mentioned that Microsoft is developing its first search engine, internally. What was there any sort of thinking that search could be a market in and of itself?
Oh yeah, I think that was very clear, and I remember,
because GoTo was around by '99, I think.
Oh yeah, GoTo was around, and this idea of kind of the AdWords marketplace, of having a bid market for exposure, that was understood to be a very compelling pricing model. So advertising at the time, as you know, I mean, internet advertising was much more about display ads, banners and other form factors, and we were doing big contracts, and Google, of course, in terms of the quality of the results, people knew they were the gold standard, and then I don't. I'm no expert in the history of search, but the way I think of it is the rise of the kind of bidding AdWords business, coupled with the fact that people's web diet became vastly more varied. Because the reason the portals were interesting was people would kind of sit down at their computer and say, I want to get something done on the internet. I just don't know how. I don't know where all this shit is. How am I going to find this stuff? And if you could go to Yahoo and they just had it all, that was awesome. And a lot of it was their own. And what wasn't their own would be some partners. And that was great. People didn't have good Google search skills. But, my kids start learning how to use Google search. School teaches them that, right along when they learn about Christopher Columbus and how plants grow. I mean, it's a very basic thing. So I think people no longer are sitting there saying, I don't know how to do it. They want to go search the whole web. And Google was the best tool and the most monetized tool. And they met that appetite at the time. So, to my mind, search was important. I remember being in briefings with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, and we'd be telling the story, and Bill Bliss was a lot smarter about this stuff than me, and had really driven our first entrant. But our first entrant was relatively modest in terms of the scale of the team. It was 80 or 100 people, which at Microsoft's not a big team. And we had a partner. I think we were working with LookSmart, and I think we felt like we were going to have something interesting, but we were definitely not saying, oh, let's replicate Google and try to do it a little bit better, which is an incredibly large venture. there was no notion of that. And I think it was after I left that it became clear that if we didn't do that, we kind of wouldn't have anything. And they went off and created Bing. That was after my time.
Right. You leave Microsoft in 2000, I guess.
Yeah, early 2000.
It's amazing how many people leave at just the right time, right when the bubble hits. It seems to be everyone had perfect timing. But in the interest of time, so I don't take up all your day, dealer's choice. Tell us what you've been up to the last 15 years or so, or tell us what you're interested in today and what you're doing today.
Well, as I've said many times since, three things happened at the same time. One is the Microsoft stock price was high. Two was I was getting pretty frustrated at Microsoft, and three was my wife got pregnant. So I left Microsoft in 2000 and got to hang out with my wife and new daughter, and moved to the Bay Area from Seattle. And I did a lot of different things over the next few years. Ran a nonprofit and did some other stuff. I mean, it's interesting. I know you kind of keep yourself involved in the internet stuff through this podcast, which is a great way to stay plugged in. I mean, for me, it's been a lot of years, and I'm working again in tech. I'm working in online corporate learning. But, there was never a time when I stopped getting up every morning and reading, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and a bunch of tech blogs and like totally nerding out on this stuff. It's just, it was a passion before it was a business, and it's a passion now. And I'm just totally fixated on Apple and what they'd been doing. And it took me around 7 years to titrate off Windows, but I'm totally off Windows. And
titrating is a good word for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we actually shut down our last Windows machine just a few weeks ago because my wife was running Quicken for Windows on it. But she finally moved to Quicken for Mac. But I just love what Apple's been doing, and so for me, it's always been about finding what's the interesting opportunity, what's not being done well, and what I found as I got older and got involved in a lot of stuff was that the most important things to learn in life are things that school doesn't teach you, practical things like managing your time or running a meeting or managing people, and then, softer skills like emotional intelligence or how to communicate. And so I've been poking around in that area for several years and did some work with a really talented group of people on exploring that through in-person learning. And now I'm working on how to bring that to people online. So you could go online and basically take a video workshop where, and I don't find conventional online learning very engaging. I don't know how your audience feels, but like watching a video of somebody talk is even less interesting than watching a lecture, and I never liked the lecture anyways. Mm-hmm. So what I've been working on is an approach where you do a workshop and you see all the other participants. You're up on video and you're talking, and you can do breakout groups and brainstorming and whiteboarding and use virtual Post-it notes and really get a rich experience that's really alive, but you can do it from home or anywhere. And organize that around some key ideas or key topics like time management or goal setting or decision making. So it's what I find for myself is it was never the internet per se that interested me. It was all about the end user benefit. Like, wouldn't it be great if you could in the mobile space, wouldn't it be great if you could capture all your ideas and carry all your contacts with you have all your notes. And of course, we all do that now with our phones. And then with shopping, it was, wouldn't it be neat if you could, have the chance to buy kind of anything from anyone, anywhere? How cool would that be? With Sidewalk, it was, really fun to help people plan their leisure time. And so, now with the education stuff, it's just kind of the next stage for me. And it's definitely amazing. I mean, people, every once in a while, somebody will kind of hear a distant echo of what I used to do and approach me and say, hey, we're looking to get someone involved who really understands, internet advertising or internet commerce. And I just laugh because, as you well know, internet advertising today has nothing to do with what it was
right
when I was at MSN. I mean, that was literally the Stone Ages. The optimization engines they have today, the targeting, I don't even begin to understand it. And I understand commerce from a consumer perspective, but the sophistication that goes on in the background is so high. And I remember soon after we sold out to Microsoft, I got wind of somebody teaching an e-commerce course at a business school, and I just cracked up. I was like, this has been happening for 2 years. Like, how do you have a course on it? How can you be an expert on it? How are you teaching it? Like, I know more than pretty much anyone, and I don't know how to teach it. It's just too new. But, of course, business schools wanted to teach it anyways. But now, I mean, there are people who've built really deep careers on this stuff. It's quite amazing how much it's changed. And I'm sure it'll keep changing. So it's just fun for me to keep poking at it.
Well, Matt Kursh, that's why it's so fun to talk to people like you, because sort of using people's careers, we can see how all this stuff has evolved, and even going all the way back to pen computing with you. So I thank you so much for coming on the podcast and remembering all that for us.
My pleasure, Brian. It's been fun.